everyone, and thank you for coming to the Dispelling Common Player Behavior Myths talk today. I know it's pretty late in the afternoon, so I do appreciate you coming out. Before we get started, the GDC organizers wanted me to make sure to let you know to please silence all of your noise-making devices as they are recording this talk. And also, they're going to be sending you a link to a survey after the talk. Please take the time to fill that out for them. Additionally, I have a few little disclaimers about this talk. I had several members from the Fair Play Alliance contribute to this talk. We're actually over 100 companies now, so that's really exciting. And I've done my best to represent their work in this talk, but to be fair to them and their work, I'm not going to do a formal Q&A at the end of this. I have asked several of them to be around, so if you do have questions afterwards, I'll make sure that you're speaking to the right person. You can just come up, we'll do an informal thing. Additionally, I do want to comment that this talk says that they're common myths, and these may be things that aren't necessarily beliefs held by the majority, but they are things that we have seen come up often enough that we thought that they were worth talking about and mentioning. So with that, let's get started. So this is our first myth, and maybe you've heard something like this, or something along these lines, or this sentiment, or that one at the bottom. So these are just examples of the types of things or sentiments that we've heard in our communities, but what do we actually see when we get to the game? So now I'm going to talk about a few facts. The first one is from Blizzard, and we found that less than 1% of our players are consistently disruptive. This means that they go on to get more than 2 penalties. And other Fair Play Alliance companies reported that consistently disruptive players were in their minority as well. And when surveyed, these players were found to be unfulfilled or disconnected from the community. So my question is, can a disconnected minority determine the culture of an entire group? And if you aren't quite sure, that's okay. I have some more facts to share. So studies have been run at both Blizzard and Riot that had a few shared key outcomes. One is that players who encounter disruptive behaviors played for shorter sessions and took longer breaks in between those sessions. And these can be predictive of eventual churn. Additionally, if we just looked at newer and our lower level players who encountered disruptive behaviors, they were much more likely to churn than the same group of players who did not encounter disruptive behaviors. Also, and lastly, players are less likely to join your game if it has a reputation for being disruptive in the first place. So you're less likely to engage new players. So again, so they're out. And again, my question is, if players leave the game because of the behaviors, do they agree that it's the culture? Or at least, do they seem to want that to be the culture? So I have one final fact for you, and it comes from Riot. They did this awesome survey of their players, and their players overwhelmingly asked them for more sportsmanship in the game. So if they're asking the game companies to do more about it, and they have this desire for companies to handle disruptive behaviors in their game, do players really want this behavior to be a part of their culture? So to wrap all that up into one neat slide that you can take a picture of, minority does not equal to culture. Disruptive behaviors can lead to churn or avoidance of your game. And there's a strong desire for sportsmanship from the player base and for the game companies to do something about it. So even if you believe that this is the culture still, it's clear that the majority of players don't want it to be this way. So if it isn't the culture, or at least players don't want it to be the culture, why is there still disruption? So let's talk about that in this myth. So maybe you've heard someone say something like this. Or how about this? Or this. Or along those lines. Again, these are the kinds of sentiments that we've seen pop up, but they don't seem to be consistent with what we're seeing in the game. So let's talk a little bit about that. So if we just learned that consistently disruptive players are in the minority, Why is there still disruption? Well, in reality, most players have been reported for disruptive behavior at some point. Maybe it was because of your name, maybe you were AFK for too long, maybe you were suiciding, maybe you participated in friendly fire. Whether intentional or not, most players have at least one report against them. And the reasons that the majority of these players who aren't consistently getting reports, they're motivated by different circumstances. So we're going to talk about a little bit of that. This won't be a complete list. There are plenty of motivations out there that I won't talk about, but we'll talk about some of the main ones that different companies have seen pop up in surveys or forums or different media. So one is players just think that they're critiquing other players. They don't realize that the way in which they're critiquing can be overly harsh or from that other player's point of view, especially when you consider that a lot of games nowadays that are match-based have you talking to strangers who really don't understand the way that you talk or your banter with teammates. Additionally, they could think that they aren't being the problem because other people are underperforming or not trying, and they're really what's bringing down the team. There could also be in-game stimuli, such as being on a losing streak, which could be really frustrating, or we just saw in the last myth that disruptive players encountering those are frustrating, and maybe the core design of the game has been pushed too far. A lot of these in-game stimuli are things that maybe we can control, but there are also things that we can't control that are out of the game stimuli. And this is maybe having a bad day at work or school. Maybe you got into a fight with your friend, your spouse. Maybe your kid's not sleeping, so you're just really sleepy. And it is important to realize that there may be things that you can't control in your game, but there'll always be things that you can't control that's outside your game as well. So to wrap all this up into one nice sentence, two sentences, most players have been reported for disruptive behavior at some point, and it's important to evaluate if your game can do anything about the motivations for disruption that are within your control. And for more about how you can deal with this, we'll move on to our next myth. So maybe you've heard questions like this, or something like this, or this one. Well, what do we know? What can we talk about that can kind of start to answer some of these? And one is something that we just talked about. We just learned in the last two myths that there are two types of disruptive players. There are consistently disruptive players who are in the minority that are disconnected from the community but cause a lot of disruption in every game, or in most games that they're in, not every game. And then there are occasionally disruptive players, which make up most of your player base and are motivated by stimuli both in-game and out of game, but each individual player adds a smaller amount of disruption to the games that they're in. So when we start looking at it, we started looking at what seemed to be really effective for consistently disruptive players. And one of the things that Blizzard saw was when we implemented machine learning validation to empower player reports, we were able to more quickly punish behaviors that we were certain were bad. And this allowed us to address players' behavior faster and closer to the infraction, which significantly reduced the likelihood that these players would go on to reoffend. Additionally, Riot implemented reform cards, which provide feedback to players about what they said or did in game to earn their penalty, and these helped these players understand what they were doing wrong, both from the game company's standards and from other players, because they actually allowed the players to put these reform cards online, and other players were able to comment and tell them that they did agree that what they did was disruptive to the game. It also helped reduce their appeals ticket and increase trust in their system. And finally, Blizzard also saw a decrease in disruptive behaviors when we increased the severity of penalties. So we just talked about what seemed to work for consistently disruptive players. So what about our occasionally disruptive players? These players are not as likely to cause as much disruption each, which means that they may not ever hit our penalization structures, but they're still causing some disruption in game. So with these players, it may be worth looking at how do we prevent them from doing that in the first place. And with this, Blizzard recently introduced the endorsement system in Overwatch, and we saw a 40% decrease in matches containing disruptive behaviors globally just since the introduction of this system. And Riot has seen very similar success since the launch of their Honor 2.0 system, which also is a positive reinforcement system, and they both utilize rewarding good behavior to encourage positive play. They also create a definition for what good looks like through the categories available to assign to someone. So in endorsements, it's shot caller, good teammate, and sportsmanship. And in league, that's stayed cool, GG heart, and great shot caller. And finally, these games create a vector to communicate status. So this would be your honor level or your endorsement level that's displayed on your profile, under your portrait, and on your profile page. So, in conclusion, with more than one type of disruptive player, you may need more than one solution. And sometimes when we talk about solutions, we hear this next myth. And maybe they say something like this. Or maybe they have this sentiment. Or this one. So, one thing that we've seen is culturally, linguistically, and behaviorally, language is consistently shown to be a poor proxy for intent in online spaces. So, for instance, if you have two people, and one person is being intentionally hateful, and the other person uses similar language, but it's simply been absorbed from their peer groups, or they're too immature to understand the impact of their language. These two people look the same, but one can be influenced and educated through systems or design decisions. And we miss the opportunity for change if we just ban them. We have talked about some of the ways that we've seen successes with reform, with Riot's reform cards and the endorsement systems in Overwatch and Honor 2.0 in League. So we know that the majority of players will reform. Additionally, it encourages players to just make new accounts. And this does two things. It, one, just displaces the behavior. It just pops up in another place. And two, it makes the accounts disposable in the players' minds. And when they're disposable in their minds, now any consequences or repercussions you put against that account loses its power. So, in conclusion, language is not 100% of intent in online spaces. You miss an opportunity for change. It displaces rather than removes the behavior. And disposable accounts equals less power and repercussions. So, another solution that I've seen people bring up has been this one. And you've seen sentiments like this. Or maybe this sounds familiar. Or this one. Or this. And with this myth, there's actually been a lot of work in other areas that we can lean on to understand the repercussions of doing something like this. So, one thing I think is important to keep in mind as I'm talking about this is that the majority of players are not consistently disruptive. The majority of players, their normal state is to be a positive influence in the game, or at least not to be a disruptive influence in the game. So if we look at studies from both prison systems and military leadership, they have shown that if you group disruptive people together, then you normalize those players, especially for people who could have reformed. You take them from the general population, you put them with a bunch of people who are being disruptive, and they start to see that as the normal behaviors for this space. And when they're removed from that space, they continue on with those behaviors, where if you had educated them or worked on reforming them, then they would have changed. Additionally, again, it encourages new account creation. We saw in the last few myths that players really don't like being around other disruptive players. It will cause them to churn or to just create a new account to get out of this queue or this group. And when you have the same consequence. When it becomes disruptive, when it becomes disposable, then the repercussions or consequences lose their power against the account. So in conclusion, grouping leads to normalization of whatever behaviors you're grouping towards. So if you want the normalization to be towards positive behaviors, you should keep people in mostly positive spaces. You're less likely to reform if you are grouped into disruptive spaces, and disposable accounts leads to less power and repercussions. So when people talk about some of the causes of disruptive behavior, one of the things that seems to come up is this myth. And it might look like this, or this might be familiar, or something like this. And this myth is actually pretty interesting because it's part right. Anonymity and being anonymous does contribute, but it's not the sole cause, which a lot of times when people speak about this, they want to say that if you just got rid of it, then everything would be fine. And the thing is that we have some examples that kind of counter that point. So there are countries like Korea that actually require players to link their national ID to their game account. And we don't see any less disruption in those countries than in other countries that do not require you to do so. Additionally, we had someone from the Fair Play Alliance point out that Second Life actually links players' accounts through age and identity verification to their driver's license. And the players who have their driver's license linked, some of them still are disruptive. And finally, there's Facebook. So Facebook, you can actually have your real name, your work history, your family. You can have a family portrait in the profile picture, and people have still seen those people go on to make disruptive comments. So it's not the sole cause, but what else is going on? So one of the things that we've been digging into is lack of consequences, particularly socially, contribute to disruptive behaviors. And these are the kinds of things that Overwatch's endorsement system and Riot's Honor 2.0 system have started to try to work with. They've injected some positive social consequences into their respective games. And since their launches, both games have seen drastic reduction in disruptive behaviors. Also, if we want to look into other ecosystems outside of games, we can look at eBay seller ratings. If you have two sellers selling the same product and one has a really positive rating, other people have said, this guy gets the items to you on time, it's not broken, it's correct, and the other one has a really poor rating, and people have said it's been late or it's slow, then you're much more likely to go with the positive rating, even though both those sellers are completely anonymous. And the same is even true if the poor rating has better stuff, you still will probably hedge your bet and go with a safer rated seller. But there are other things that contribute. It's not just that, it's not just being anonymous. So something would be ease of forming in-groups and out-groups. And related to that would be poor identity markers to really relate to each other in-game. And kind of related, the ease of distancing yourself from reality. These things are really easy to do when you're in an online space and you're using avatars and you're not really seeing the other people. And the last two are also kind of related. It's insufficient opportunities for players to meaningfully connect and rarely persistence in relationships. And what these really are for a lot of games nowadays that are match-based, where you have a matchmaker that teams you up and you're together for like 1, maybe 2 matches, and then you're not matched up anymore and you're unlikely to have friended that. I kind of look at that as having like a vacation effect. You know, like when you go on vacation, especially someplace really far from your house, you might act differently because these people are never going to see you again, right? So you can not be your normal self. Well, in games, it's kind of the equivalent, where you're only going to play 1, maybe 2 matches with these people, and then you're never going to see them again. Or by the time you do, you won't recognize each other's gamer tags anymore. So that's that. And I do want to point out that this is not a complete list. There are plenty of other factors that contribute. These are just some of the ones that we have been looking at lately that have come up in different surveys and media, but I'm sure there are loads more out there. I could probably fill several slides with things that contribute. So in conclusion, disruption still exists in non-anonymous ecosystems, and there are many, many factors that contribute to disruptive behaviors. So, on to the last one, which it's okay if you don't know what hug boxing is, because I've got some nice quotes. It's kind of these things that we've seen since we started talking about our efforts. And so we just wanted to talk a little bit about what we're doing. So the key here is disruptive behavior. What is it? What does it look like in gaming? What does it look like across different kinds of games? And what motivates players to behave in this way? These are the kinds of questions that we're really looking into. There's plenty of room for games and communities of all shapes and sizes. Not everyone needs to be kid-friendly. We want people to be their authentic selves, but we also want to protect the intended core experience for all of our players. So, the conclusion there is basically, you should be your authentic, awesome self, but we also need to protect the core experience for all of our players playing our games. Thank you.